Welcome everybody. Today's chapter is called Towards Holy Week. Let us go back to the point in the story when Peter, the leader amongst the closest followers of Jesus, had with intuitive insight put his finger on the truth about their beloved but always rather mysterious master. Jesus had said and done so many things that his disciples had only dimly understood, but they all pointed in one direction. The reason why Jesus' most intimate associates have been so slow to recognize him as the Messiah is not hard to seek. He was neither a heaven-sent visitant from the skies, nor had he shown any sign of being a politically minded saviour of his people from the Romans. For men brought up to expect Messiah to be one or other of these things, it took time to recognize him in the former village joiner from Nazareth. It had been the cumulative effect of Jesus' ministry upon his disciples that had led Peter, in the name of the rest, to this startling conclusion. Their master was no mere rabbi, or even a prophet like John the Baptist. His claim to have the right to criticize the sacred law of Moses, his scathing indictment of the official representatives of the established religion, his power over disease and death, and above all, the sense he gave them that when they were with him, they were somehow brought close to God. All this to serious-minded Jews brought upon the Old Testament could on reflection only mean one thing. Jesus must be the Messiah, God's unique representative on earth. Jesus had reached this conviction himself at his baptism. But in his time of solitary wrestling in the wilderness, with the problem of how this should work out in practice, he had decided before even his public ministry began that his role as Messiah must be that of Isaiah's servant of the Lord, who would, by a life of service and inevitable suffering, bring people to the true knowledge of God. Nothing less than this would lead them to the truth about God and themselves, namely that God suffers for his children's folly more than any human father suffers, and that in the service of others we come to see the truth about our own lives. In Jesus' words, we have to lose ourselves to find them. That is to say, that by giving ourselves for others, we reach the fulfillment of our own being. This was the role that Jesus had chosen for himself, and which he invited his followers to share. For obvious reasons, because of its political associations in men's minds, Jesus had discouraged the use of the word Messiah about himself. Nor indeed did he call himself the servant of the Lord in so many words, although his whole ministry was based on service. What seems to have been fundamental to Jesus' thinking was his sense of sonship to God, a unique and intimate relationship, which is reflected in his frequent reference to God as my Father. But the words that he most often used to describe himself were Son of Man. This takes us back to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, where in one of his visions, Daniel sees the empires of the world, pictured as monsters, being replaced by a new kind of community, the saints of the Most High, with the Son of Man as their ruler. It would seem then that Jesus is in calling himself Son of Man, thinks of himself as leader and representative of the new Israel, with his 12 disciples as its nucleus, fulfilling the mission that the old Israel had failed to accomplish, and ultimately embracing the whole world. The prelude to this future success must be, however, to tread the path of Isaiah's servant, which means suffering, self-sacrifice, and death. It's noticeable from the record of the Gospels that from the point when Peter made his great confession of faith that Jesus was indeed God's Messiah, there is a new note of urgency and crisis in Jesus' ministry. He had to teach his disciples the hard facts about what Messiahship involved. They could not rid themselves of the idea that it must somehow involve earthly triumph and sovereignty. Jesus had to convince them that the triumph of his cause could only come through rejection, humiliation, and death. They were helped to see something of what the ultimate triumph would mean in the dramatic experience of the Transfiguration, when they had a vision of the glorified Christ as he was to be, and saw Jesus as the sole saviour of men. Meantime, however, the goal was Jerusalem, the centre of the religious life of the nation. Jesus, as God's Messiah, was determined to throw down the gauntlet there to the custodians of Israel's faith, who had perverted the purpose of God as enshrined in the law and the prophets. He set out to make a stand for the God of Moses, Amos, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, against the travesty of religion that both Sadducees and Pharisees were offering to the people. The people of God were like sheep without a shepherd. Satan reigned even in God's holy temple. The rich faith of the Psalms had been replaced by meaningless ritual sacrifices and pettifogging rules for daily behaviour. Self-righteousness and bigotry were enthroned in place of compassion and simple piety. So, in the name of God, Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem to do battle with evil as he'd always done. But now it was not with Satan's power over men's minds and bodies, but with his power over the state religion itself. The sense of crisis and urgency shines through the record. However long the journey to Jerusalem may have taken, we are constantly aware of the fixed purpose of Jesus. There's a revealing scene of the Master striding ahead with his disciples following behind, dazed and apprehensive. They had never been more conscious of the gulf that lay between them, for all their constant companionship, and of the mystery that lay at the heart of their relationship. They reached Jerusalem at the time of Passover. This was the annual commemoration of God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt more than 1,000 years before. It would seem that Jesus had deliberately chosen this festival, which attracted Jewish pilgrims from all around the world, to challenge the power of evil which dominated the holy city, and to deliver God's people from a greater bondage than that of any human oppressor. It's thus in the spring of the year, most likely AD 29, that what we now call Holy Week begins. The Gospel account of it is more detailed than in any other part of the story of Jesus, suggesting that it was regarded as the most important part of the record, and also perhaps that it had been written down earlier than the rest of the narrative. Between what we know as Palm Sunday and Good Friday, Jesus performed 3 significant and symbolic actions. Apart from engaging in controversy with the ecclesiastical authorities, teaching in public and instructing his disciples in private. The first symbolic act was his entry into Jerusalem, where he deliberately carried out to the letter an Old Testament prophecy, that when the Messiah came to the holy city, he would come not as a panoplied conqueror on a charger, but humble and riding on a donkey, as a Prince of Peace. As the enthusiastic crowds waved palm branches and laid their cloaks in the path of the prophet and healer from Galilee, it is perhaps unlikely that they knew the scriptures well enough to realise the significance of Jesus' act. The authorities, however, knew only too well that Jesus was now openly identifying himself with the Messiah. His popularity with the crowd compelled them to be cautious. But clearly this dangerous impostor, who had now put himself within their power, must be got rid of. Jesus' second symbolic act confirmed their resolution. The temple in Jerusalem was constructed in a series of open courts, each of increasing holiness, until at the centre there was reached the tabernacle containing the Holy of Holies, the symbol of the presence of God in the midst of his people. The outermost court was called the Court of the Gentiles. What lay behind this was the excellent idea that there was a place for non-Jews within the house of God. By accepting the law of Moses A Gentile was entitled to pass the barrier leading to the court of Israel, and thus become incorporated in the people of God. The priestly Sadducees, however, who controlled the temple, had allowed the court of the Gentiles to become little more than a fairground. It was cluttered up with the stalls of vendors who sold birds and animals, officially certified free from blemish and therefore suitable for sacrifice. In addition, the annual temple tax payable by all Jews had to be paid in ritually approved coinage. Booths for changing any other kind of money into clean money were also located in the Gentiles' court. The result was that the Gentiles were literally being pushed out of the house of God by this blatant commercialism, which brought considerable revenue to the priesthood. This was the unholy scene which confronted Jesus as he entered the temple. Snatching up some rope, he made a rough and ready whip and indignantly drove the traders with their sheep and cattle out of the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers and scattering their coins on the ground. It was not a humanitarian protest against the practice of animal sacrifice, although elsewhere in the Gospels we're told that Jesus thought this senseless. It was a protest in the name of God by his Messiah against the travesty of religion that was being encouraged in the historic shrine of the people of God. The temple was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. The priesthood had turned it into an open market and a veritable den of thieves. The Gentiles were not only being squeezed out of their legitimate place within the symbolic area of God's concern and denied access to him. Worse than that, they were being discouraged from ever wanting to know more about the one true God by this caricature of what the faith of Israel was really all about. In the mind of Jesus, he had struck a blow for God against Satan in the very place where Satan ought never to have been allowed entrance. In the mind of the authorities, this was the last straw. The only question was how they could arrest him without causing an uproar among the people. Jesus was spending each night of Holy Week with friends in a village outside the city. During the day, he was surrounded by his supporters, and the Jerusalem crowds had as little love for the Sadducees and their minions, the temple police, as had Jesus himself. Unexpected help came in the way of the authorities when one of Jesus' own disciples offered to lead the police to a spot where they could apprehend him quietly under cover of darkness. No one has ever understood the motives of Judas Iscariot. It seems hardly likely that he was motivated by greed, for the reward was trifling. Was he a disappointed patriot who had at last come to the conclusion that he'd backed the wrong kind of Messiah? Or did he think that by forcing Jesus' hand to resist arrest, he might yet drive him to exert his supernatural powers and turn the tables on his enemies? We shall never know. At all events, it was with the knowledge that one of his own closest friends had betrayed him that Jesus arranged to hold his Last Supper with his disciples. It was a secret rendezvous, and it was at this Last Supper that Jesus enacted his third piece of symbolism. It came at the end of a meal which had for all present a sense of finality, heightened by Jesus' words that one of the little group had turned traitor. He then took bread and wine and enacted his death before them. He broke the bread, blessed it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup of wine, and having similarly blessed it, he gave it to them with the words, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." These solemn words and actions, as St. Paul tells us, were among the earliest traditions to be handed on to converts in the first years of the Church's mission, and they are still at the heart of the chief sacrament in the Church's worship. But what did Jesus mean by them? He knows he's going to his death, not merely because of the vindictiveness of the Jewish religious leaders, or because one of his disciples had betrayed him. He is giving his life for his friends as the ultimate act of the service which has been the keynote of his whole ministry. One of the Gospels includes at this Last Supper the impressive object lesson in service where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. It's in this same spirit that he now speaks of his death. As Son of Man, conscious of his unique relationship to God and of his unique vocation, Jesus is about to fulfill the last and greatest act in the role of the servant of whom Isaiah had spoken. He will give his life in the belief that only through his death will God's purpose for the world be realized. Only through his death will the rule of God come, as he said, with power. When he speaks of the new relationship or covenant between God and man that his death will bring about, he's speaking of the life of the new Israel, which at that moment was represented by 11 timid, ordinary men. But such was Jesus' faith that he believed that out of this sorry handful, God would create the new community, the church, which would be his instrument for the salvation and enlightenment of the world.